Earlier this year, there was a research paper that was released and it made headlines because there's this specific circulation, a very important circulation that affects temperature all around the world, especially in the Atlantic, that we'll talk about today. That the prediction was it was going to stop. And if it stops, then all hell is going to break loose around the world. We're going to see major floods, we're going to see droughts, all this crazy, crazy stuff. And the paper had some good points. The paper had some valid points. However, a new paper just came out that said, hey, you know what? It's probably not going to happen anytime this century, as that other paper predicted. And I feel like the communication of these types of papers are very important because when we have such a drastic conclusion, even though it makes great headlines, it doesn't always do justice to people who are reading this or hearing the headlines or just reading the headlines or hearing it from friends. So we're going to talk about that communication on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is a podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. We're going to talk about speaking up for the ocean today because I think this topic is really important, especially when it comes to papers that make huge headlines. And I mean like drastic headlines, where the world is going to end kind of headlines. And that's something that we have to be careful of as researchers. But before we get into that, I'm just going to let you know I am using a different microphone and I am recording in a different way because I'm at my parents' place. So I was had to come over here at a last minute. And so I'm doing this with a different microphone, a Shure MV88 Plus, which is a really great microphone. But if it sounds a little different than normal, I apologize, but it's something that I just have to do. I'd rather put out content with a different microphone than not put out content at all and try and be at home in my studio where I can have my microphone, all my sound effects and so forth, and my music ready to go. I decided to just do it and just get the content out. So that's what we're going to work off of that today. So I apologize if there are any plosives or anything like that, or it sounds really, really different, but I appreciate your patience when we do this. Regardless, we're talking about something that's really important to me, and I think it should be really important to you. And that is the communication around papers that really make huge headlines around the world. There was a paper a while ago that said that the commercial fisheries was going to be non-existent. All the commercial fisheries right now was going to collapse by the time we hit 2048, and people run with that, including the movie Seaspiracy. Even though that headline, that piece of that paper, was debunked by the author themselves, and I find that interesting how it still gets called today. The headline that headline of that paper kind of just got off on its own and almost made its own headlines when it really wasn't true. And when it goes into a movie that gets, a documentary that gets published on Netflix, a huge platform for streaming, where it makes that movie makes the top 10, and it's such a big line. It's like it's one of those parts of a story that just it kind of takes away from the rest of the story, because everybody's like, oh my gosh, we have all these commercial fisheries. Half the world, or more than half the world, depends on these commercial fisheries, and now all these commercial fisheries are going to essentially be non-existent and collapse by 2048 if we don't do something, if we don't stop eating fish. That was the message of Seaspiracy. I've talked about Seaspiracy a number of times and how much I found that movie just to be headline rich and just not true at all. And using that 2048, fisheries are going to collapse in 2048 headline or piece just made it even worse because it has been debunked. But now communicators like myself had to go around and had to argue with people that this is not a good piece of science, to use. This is one that's been debunked by the author themselves. And people just tend to listen to that or ignore it or listen to it. And then once it gets debunked, they find that out. They just kind of go ahead and do their own thing. They use that still, and they use it as still part of their argument. And it's just not right. And so we have to be careful as science communicators. as journalists, even of what type of headline we pick up. Because here's the balance of journalism these days. The bigger the headline, the more clicks you get. And the more clicks you get, the more advertising money you get. And that is with everything these days. Not only like, the Washington Post or the New York Times or, Fox News or CNN, when you go on their websites or you hit a link because of a headline, because you want to read more about on their website, they get advertising money for that. And it's really the same for podcasting. There are a lot of podcasts out there that will take headlines, even in the ocean, that will say, hey, huge shark attack happened, at the, in the Arctic or in the Atlantic, a great white shark attacks, diver or somebody like that. And it's just, it gets them clicks, it gets them downloads. So for a podcast, the more downloads you have, the more money you make. And so the more money you make, that's even better for you as a podcaster, because it's really hard to, make money as a podcaster. So you want to get those clicks, you want to get those downloads. So you're going to make those headlines as big as possible. And that's what the 2048 fisheries does. That's what a lot of the shark attacks do. They make a lot of money by putting out clicks or putting out headlines, clickable headlines, like clickbait, basically. And that's just something that I find, I would rather put out the content that's right and then get it right, or even put out these types of headlines, but put the right information in there. And that's something that we have to be careful of. And so the story that we're talking about today, the topic is called it's about the Atlantic meridional. Wow, I can't say that. The Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, AMOC. That's the name of it. And essentially it's a circulation that runs from the Gulf of Mexico using the Gulf Stream, and it goes all the way up to the northern part of Europe. But it also has to do with, it affects the Western Atlantic or western coast of Africa. And this huge circulation is really important to the ocean, to regulating climate, to making sure that it doesn't overheat, that the tropics don't overheat, and that the poles or the temperate areas are not too cold. And so what it does essentially is it takes the Gulf Stream from the Gulf of Mexico, it brings it up the Atlantic coast of the United States, and it kind of goes further and further away as it gets closer to Canada. It starts to cross the Atlantic right around Nova Scotia area, or just before Nova Scotia, as it goes up on an angle, probably like a 45, maybe a 30 degree, maybe 45 degree, 35 degrees angles, all the way up to the UK. And it's why the UK is kind of just not cold, but mild and rainy, because all that water, what happens is taking that warm water north, and the water is evaporating. Or the heat of the water is evaporating, causing more precipitation in like places like Nova Scotia, places like the UK. And then that salt water, that dense salt water, sinks to the bottom, and then it goes back to, underneath the water, and then it goes back into the ocean, and it gets kind of circulated around. Now, if that stops, it will affect climate around the world. There's no doubt about that. But this headline has come out, I feel like every 5 years, where we see the AMOC, talked about slowing down. Research says AMOC is slowing down, or if it stops, this is what happens. And it's kind of like a cycle that happens every once in a while. And it usually comes from a paper where you have oceanographers who come out and they do this research on it and just saying, hey, it's actually slowing down, or it's actually speeding up. And although most of them are slowing down these days, most of the papers are talking about slowing down. But for the most part, it makes big news every time this kind of comes out. And then you get the headline of, if it stops, the world is screwed, essentially. And so there's that fear. And so people want to click on that because it's based on fear and be like, wait a minute, if this circulation thing stops, where are we going to be? When is it going to happen? And they never really had a date. And it's because the AMOC pretty much is variable. It can speed up, it can slow down depending on the decade, depending on the century. It's pretty much cyclical. Well, not really cyclical. It's pretty much varies depending on how much carbon dioxide's in the atmosphere and so forth. So when we hear that this AMOC is slowing down, we never really get a date. Until this year, we got a date. It said by mid 21st century, it is going to slow down. Not only slow down, it is going to stop. And then we are going to see catastrophe. We are going to see cooling in Europe of around 5 to 10 degrees, and the tropics could become overheated. Certain areas around the world would experience severe droughts and flooding, and the oceans would become more acidic, even more than now. Everything would essentially be more than what it is now, more than what is changing. And so that would be huge. And we see rising sea levels, global heating, shifts in marine ecosystems, and seriously compromise food security. It would also seriously affect the upwelling marine ecosystem along the western margin of South Africa and Namibia, which is the most productive upwelling system in the Atlantic. So a lot of things that would happen. So this made huge news, obviously, right? However, a new paper that came out said that it's not going to happen this century. It's probably going to happen after the 22nd century. And so it's it just kind of eases our thoughts a little bit, eases our conscience a little bit. We're still in trouble, but it's probably not going to happen. It says here it provides a timeline for when AMOC could shut down anywhere between 2025 and 2095. While the consensus isn't accurate, it's a useful starting point from which other scientists could generate scenarios and models. So in that case, if it does shut down, obviously, or the thing is the paper is okay the way it was, that first paper that said it's going to shut down mid-century. It's okay to have because there's more information that puts it out. And this is what I love about science. A professor used to tell me this all the time. Just because you don't get the result that you expected doesn't mean that it's not good for science. And there's a lot that goes into that. So let's dive into that for a little bit. It essentially means if your paper doesn't really produce any results, right? It doesn't really show a trend in something. It shows, something there's no effect or something like that. And by, but for example, if I did a paper where I was looking for a trend in the communities of, say, fisheries assemblages that would show up every year, year after year after year in a stock assessment, if there was no trend or the same fisheries weren't showing up, or the same fish assemblages, so fish communities weren't showing up every year, I would think, well, hold on a second. I thought there was going to be a trend here. But if there's no trend, that's still data. And so if I publish that, right? Normally people are like, well, there's no trend, so it's going to make me look bad. I'm not going to publish it. But to publish it is good because now people can take that and be like, oh, hold on a second. Maybe I can find a way to find a trend. Or maybe, the person who originally published it, maybe they didn't do it right, or they didn't use the statistics right. Or maybe they should use a different statistical model, and maybe that'll show a trend, which would say something even more. So the fact that I would publish something that didn't show the results that I wanted, so that somebody else can build upon that, is not only what science should be, but it takes the ego out of your research. It says, hey, I put this together. It didn't work out the way I wanted. I'm going to put this in the universe, in the scientific universe. And hopefully one of you great scientists out there, we're going to take that and be like, oh yeah, hold on a second. Maybe I can build off of this. And because it's published, more people have access to it, especially scientists. So that's what the beauty of science is that no data or no relationship doesn't mean bad data or a bad study. It just means that we build upon it. And I think that's what this first initial research paper did, is it builds upon what we need. It builds upon knowing more about the statistics that goes around these models of this AMOC. And it talks about how, where we're looking at in terms of a date or when this thing could shut down if it slows down enough. What is causing it to slow down? Is there a general ratio of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere compared to what's being absorbed in the ocean? All these different types of highlights that the paper may have missed or may have highlighted is something that could be built upon in the next paper, which is what these researchers did to say, hey, you know what? It's not going to happen necessarily this century, but it might happen eventually, but just not this century. So playing around with that date could be pretty important. And it's important that people publish on this. But I think as communicators, as journalists, we have this responsibility to, even in the headline, to say, hold on a second here. Even though this paper, had dire consequences mid-century about this AMOC stopping, maybe we shouldn't worry too much. Maybe we should do more research to build upon this and find out a more accurate date when AMOC might stop, or how to continue it from going on, or how to make it not stop. That's sort of my message here, is how do we do that? How do we do that as science communicators? And that's where we put podcasts together. That's why I think podcasts are so great, because I've explained a lot within this time frame. As whatever this time frame is, it's about 15 minutes. I was able to tell you a lot of information about the history of AMOC, the papers that have come out before, the controversy surrounding it, why as journalists we need to be more responsible and making sure that the headlines don't get away from us, and why we need to explain a little better. Podcasts allow us to do that. I could spend an hour on this if I really want to. I could interview somebody who's an oceanographer who does this. Maybe the people who did the paper, or the people who did the old paper, or the new paper, or whoever. Maybe both of them at the same time. Get a little debate going. But regardless, I have that ability. And that ability really drives conversations and understanding. And you can do that in a podcast. You can do that on a YouTube video. You can do that in a blog post as well. But I like the audio. I like the video if I'm able to do it, just because people can hear the passion, they can hear the tone, they can hear right from the horse's mouth, essentially, the scientist, the researcher, to find out how they feel about the science, how they feel about their paper. It's really one little analogy before I go, and I've mentioned this before if you haven't heard it, on one of these communication podcasts that we do every Wednesday. And that is, when you look at what's on YouTube right now in the podcasting world, I look at football players, because football players have come out with a number of football players have come out with podcasts, and it's allowed football players, people in the NFL, to have a platform to state their case and to show off their personality. There have been so many times when I grew up, I'm a huge NFL football fan, growing up in the 80s and 90s. And then, being a football fan in the 2000s, 2010s, and even 2020s, I'm probably more of a football fan than I ever was. I used to hear these narratives of football players, and those narratives either put forth by the league, put forth by an agent, put forth by a team, that were extremely negative. These were stories where you would get only one side, and you wouldn't hear the side of the actual athlete, because they didn't really have a platform unless they were on TV. And if you know anything about the NFL or agents or teams, they have a lot of control in what gets on TV. But having a podcast, having a YouTube channel, allows players to have a platform to state their case. And a lot of the times when you hear some of those stories that have come out, and I'm not talking about the illegal stuff that happened or anything like that, talking about just stories that painted the attitude of the player in a bad light, which could have, and some ruined their careers. Having the platform as a podcast or as a video podcast has really changed the attitude of a lot of the players, of how people see the players, because they can hear it right from them. And whether some of those stories are true or not, it doesn't matter. Having that ability to see what they go through, what they were going through at the time, puts things in more perspective. Even there's a Netflix show called Quarterbacks. And I know I'm talking a lot about football, but I have to talk about this because it puts it in perfect line with what I'm trying to say here. When this show Quarterbacks shows what 3 quarterbacks in the NFL that went through last year, they followed them through the year last year. One guy even made it to the Super Bowl and won the Super Bowl, Patrick Mahomes. But it shows the work that they do, how they take care of their body, how they interact with their families, and how their families interact with them during the season, and just what they do on a constant basis, the names of the plays, how long they are, and how quirky some of those plays are called, and how they come up with some plays in the middle of the third quarter of the game to, as they point out a weakness in the defense. All that information, all that, the toughness, the grit, allows those quarterbacks to have a platform, allow the quarterbacks to have a platform to say their case. And the perfect example is Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins is a guy who you wouldn't think is exciting to listen to. he's just nothing wrong with him. He's just a straight in the middle of the pack, like quarterback, white, we all knew he was kind of religious, and it wasn't like exciting. He didn't have like a huge personality or anything like that. He made some headlines every once in a while, and he's a decent quarterback. But this quarterback show, a lot of people watch the quarterback show, and they have so much more respect for Kirk Cousins after they watch it. And I'll let you watch it to find out why, but they have so much more respect, basically based on what they saw during the show, during that 6-part series. And I thought it was wonderful. And I think the same thing could be done for scientists, which is one of the reasons why I started the podcasting, was to hear right from the scientist's mouth. And I'm saying all this because this has to do with what we're talking about here. It has to do with not only how we communicate the message, but who communicates the message. And that's why it's so important for people like myself, for people like you, to start putting out messages, telling your stories of what you've been through, what your friends have been through, what your colleagues have been through in the marine science and conservation world, so that people understand where we're really living at. We're in that bubble we're living at, what we can do on an individual basis, what we can do as a community basis and a national and international community. And then also, what's happening with the ocean, the education aspect, the news aspect, the conservation aspect. There's so many different angles that you can take when you start putting this forward. It just makes it so much better for the audience members. I've had a lot of people from my audience engage with me afterwards on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. And they've said, "Hey, Andrew, I love the way you tell this story. I love the way that you actually highlighted this story and the way you did it and what you mentioned during it." And that makes me feel great, because that was the purpose. But it's also nice when people see that, and that's what they're looking for, and that's why they listen to this podcast, and that's why they listen to other podcasts with other people, because they connect with them and they like the way they tell the stories and what they put into those stories. And I think that's really important. So that's my long-tailed, I guess, rant or reasoning of doing this episode and this podcast, is to say, look, whether the AMOC starts or stops or speeds up or slows down, the more research we do on it is better, the better. But we have to be careful how we communicate some of that research. And we have to make sure that people understand that it's still research. It can change at any time. And there's a lot of variability within the AMOC, and that we just need to be careful of how we communicate it. So anyway, I hope this mic worked. I hope this is good sounding for you. It's an expensive mic. I'm not saying it's a cheap mic. It's almost a $300 microphone, but it's just a little different than what I normally do. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Love to hear what you think about the actual topic of the episode. Hit me up on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. That's at How to Protect the Ocean. You can also go to speakupforblue.com/contact and fill out that form. It goes right to my personal email address. And of course, if you want me to hear your voice, which I want to hear your voice, you can go to speakupforblue.com. At the bottom right-hand page, there's a microphone. Just click on that microphone and then leave me a voice message. I would love to hear your voice on what you think of the podcast. And then, of course, share this episode with somebody that you think would get a benefit and great value out of it. And of course, if you have the time and you're able to do so and you love the show, please provide a review on Apple and on Spotify. I read each and every one of the reviews. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. It just helps me not only get better as a podcaster, but when I hear good things that are said, I'm really happy about it, and it makes me feel good. It makes me more motivated to put out more episodes. So far it's been working. It's 1,517 is this episode. So anyway, I want to thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.